Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. At 62, Hank Rollins thought his life was winding down on a failing Wyoming ranch, counting dollars and nursing regrets. When a sick buffalo calf wheezed through the livestock auction that dusty afternoon, every rancher turned away. The animal was clearly dying, a waste of money and time. But something stirred in Hank's weathered heart. He raised his hand and bid $2, not because he needed another mouth to feed, but because no living thing should face death alone. What happened next transformed not just the buffalo he named Mercy, but an entire community. Could one desperate act of compassion turn a broken ranch into a sanctuary of hope? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive home from the auction house took Hank Rollins through 20 miles of Wyoming, countryside that had watched 3 generations of his family scratch out a living from stubborn soil. His 1995 Ford pickup wheezed almost as badly as the buffalo calf in the trailer behind him, but both had made it this far, and that was something. Hank's fingers found the thin gold chain around his neck, following it down to where Martha's wedding ring rested against his heart. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days since the cancer took her, but who was counting? He was apparently marking time like a prisoner waiting for his own sentence to end. The Rollins Ranch sprawled across 800 acres of high plains, bordered by the Bighorn Mountains to the west, and endless sky in every other direction. From a distance, it still looked like the thriving operation his grandfather had built in 1952, but distance was kind that way. Up close, you could see the rust eating through the barn roof, the fence posts leaning like old men after a long night, and the paint peeling off the farmhouse like sunburned skin. Martha had always said the place had good bones, and she was right. The bones were about all that remained of the dreams they'd built together. The cattle were long gone, sold off to pay medical bills that kept coming even after the patient was buried. The quarter horses that had been Martha's pride were grazing in other pastures now, traded for chemotherapy treatments that bought them 6 extra months and not 1 day more. Hank pulled into the gravel driveway, the truck's engine ticking like a tired clock as it cooled. The buffalo calf hadn't made a sound since they'd loaded her, and for a moment he wondered if his $2 Mercy purchase had already passed on to whatever place sick animals go when they finally surrender. But when he peered into the trailer, 2 dark eyes stared back at him, with a mixture of fear and something else, maybe hope. Though Hank had never been good at reading the minds of humans, let alone buffalo, "Well, girl," he said softly, his voice carrying the roughness of a man who spent most days talking to himself. "Welcome to the Rollins Ranch. It ain't much, but it's home." The calf was smaller than he'd remembered from the auction, probably no more than 200 pounds soaking wet. Her coat was dull and patchy, and each breath came with visible effort. Dr. Sarah Chen had been right when she'd whispered to him before the bidding started. This one was touch and go, more go than touch, if he was being honest with himself. He'd known Sarah since she was fresh out of veterinary school. 15 years ago, when the ranch still hummed with life and purpose. She'd delivered dozens of calves in these fields, had sat with him and Martha through long nights when prize heifers struggled with difficult births. Sarah understood the rhythm of ranch life, the delicate balance between hope and pragmatism that kept ranchers sane. "You know, she's probably not going to make it," Sarah had said at the auction, her voice gentle but firm. "Respiratory infection, maybe pneumonia. Could be genetic, could be environmental. Either way, she's going to need round-the-clock care and medication that'll cost more than you paid for her." Hank had nodded, watching the calf struggle for each breath. "Sometimes it's not about the money, Doc." Sarah had studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that made her soften. "Your Martha always said you had a heart bigger than your bank account. I'll stop by tomorrow with some antibiotics and show you what to do." Now standing in his empty barnyard with a sick buffalo calf and $2 less in his pocket, Hank wondered if Martha would have approved. She'd always been the practical one, the voice of reason when his compassion threatened to override common sense. But she'd also been the woman who'd insisted they take in that three-legged dog that wandered onto their property one winter, who'd nursed countless orphaned calves by hand when their mothers couldn't or wouldn't care for them. The barn still smelled like hay and leather and decades of honest work, though the stalls stood empty now except for dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight. Hank had cleaned out the corner stall that morning, spreading fresh straw and filling the water trough. He'd told himself he was just maintaining the facility, keeping things ready for better times that might never come. Now he realized he'd been preparing a place for hope. Getting the calf from the trailer to the stall took 20 minutes and most of his remaining energy. She was weak but stubborn, typical of her species, and wanted to examine every inch of ground between the truck and her destination. Hank didn't rush her. He'd learned long ago that healing couldn't be hurried, whether you were dealing with sick animals or grieving hearts. Once she was settled in the stall with fresh water and a small pile of the best hay he could afford, Hank sat on an overturned bucket and really looked at her. She was young, maybe 4 months old, with the blocky build that would make her magnificent if she lived long enough to grow into it. Her eyes held intelligence, the kind of awareness that separated buffalo from their domestic cousins. "You remind me of someone," he said, though he couldn't quite place who. Stubborn as the day is long, fighting when the smart thing would be to quit. The calf regarded him with what might have been curiosity, then returned to the serious business of eating. That was encouraging. In Hank's experience, animals that had given up stopped eating first. As evening settled over the ranch, Hank found himself sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee and a collection of veterinary supply catalogues that had been gathering dust since Martha's illness. The numbers were daunting. Antibiotics, supplements, specialized feed, not to mention Dr. Chen's fees for house calls. By any reasonable calculation, he was about to spend 10 times what the calf was worth on the slim chance she might survive. But reasonable had never been Hank's strong suit, especially not since Martha died. Reasonable would have been selling the ranch 2 years ago when the bank first started sending polite letters about missed payments. Reasonable would have been moving into town, maybe getting a job at the hardware store where they knew his name and appreciated his way with tools. Instead, he was sitting alone on a porch that creaked with every gust of wind, planning to dump his dwindling savings into a sick buffalo that might not see Christmas. Martha would have called him a foolish old man, then rolled up her sleeves to help him do it anyway. The thought brought the first smile he'd felt in weeks. Maybe that's who the calf reminded him of. His late wife, fighting until the very end, simply because giving up wasn't in her vocabulary. If that was true, then the $2 might turn out to be the best investment he'd ever made. The mountains caught the last light of day, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that Martha had always said were God's way of ending each day with a blessing. Hank finished his coffee, checked his watch, and headed back to the barn. The night shift was about to begin, and he had a buffalo to save. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at 7 the next morning, her veterinary kit in one hand and a cup of coffee from Murphy's Diner in the other. She'd always been an early riser, but Hank suspected she'd made a special effort today, driven by the same mixture of professional curiosity and personal concern that had characterized their friendship for 15 years. "How'd she do overnight?" Sarah asked, following Hank into the barn where the buffalo calf stood in the corner stall, still breathing hard but alert enough to track their movements with suspicious eyes. "Restless," Hank admitted. "She ate some hay around midnight, drank a little water. But that cough kept her up most of the night." "Kept me up too." Sarah set down her coffee and approached the stall slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She'd learned long ago that nervous animals could sense anxiety from across a room, and this little one was clearly on edge. "What are you calling her?" The question caught Hank off guard. He'd been thinking about it since dawn, when he'd found himself humming an old hymn while mixing feed. "Mercy," he said, the name feeling right the moment he spoke it. After that song Martha used to sing when she was working in the garden. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth he'd seen from anyone in weeks. "Mercy it is then. Now let's see what we're dealing with." The examination took 40 minutes and confirmed Hank's worst fears. Mercy's temperature was elevated, her breathing labored, and the rattling sound in her chest suggested fluid buildup in the lungs. Sarah listened with her stethoscope, felt for swollen lymph nodes, and checked the calf's eyes and mouth with the thoroughness of a detective gathering evidence. Pneumonia, she confirmed, pulling off her latex gloves. Pretty advanced case, too. Her left lung sounds like it's got significant congestion. The good news is she's young and she's fighting. The bad news is we're probably looking at weeks of intensive care, assuming she responds to treatment at all. Hank had been expecting this verdict, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a punch to the gut. What does that mean exactly? Intensive care? Sarah pulled a notebook from her kit and began writing. Antibiotics every 12 hours, anti-inflammatory medication, respiratory therapy if we can manage it. She'll need to stay warm and dry, and you'll have to monitor her temperature twice daily. Any sign of deterioration, increased breathing difficulty, loss of appetite, lethargy, and you call me immediately. She tore off the page and handed it to him. The list looked like a part-time job, complete with medication schedules and warning signs to watch for. At the bottom, she'd written her cell phone number in large, clear numbers. Sarah, I need to ask you straight, what are we looking at cost-wise? Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, calculating figures in her head. The medications alone will run about $300, maybe $400 if we need to adjust the treatment. My fees for the follow-up visits, she paused, studying Hank's face. Let's worry about that later. Right now, let's focus on getting Mercy through the next few days. After Sarah left with promises to return the following morning, Hank stood alone in the barn with his patient and a growing sense of responsibility that felt both familiar and terrifying. The last time he'd committed to this level of care, it had been for Martha, and despite everything they'd tried, everything they'd spent, everything they'd hoped for, the outcome had been the same, but Mercy wasn't Martha, and this wasn't cancer. This was pneumonia in a young, strong animal with the genetic toughness of a species that had survived blizzards, droughts, and near extinction. If there was hope to be found anywhere, it might be here in this barn with this stubborn calf who refused to quit breathing. Hank's first priority was making Mercy comfortable. He'd raised enough cattle over the years to know that stressed animals didn't heal well, and everything about this situation, the strange surroundings, the absence of her herd, the presence of an unfamiliar human, was designed to keep her on edge. He started by fashioning a collar from soft rope. Nothing fancy, but functional enough to keep her from wandering if she got stronger. The rope was old but clean, left over from Martha's macrame phase 10 years earlier. She'd made plant hangers and wall decorations with it, turning their modest ranch house into something that belonged in a home and garden magazine. The irony wasn't lost on him that her hobby supplies were now helping save a buffalo. Easy. Girl, he murmured as he worked the collar around Mercy's neck, adjusting it loose enough for comfort but secure enough to serve its purpose. This is just so you don't go wandering off and get yourself into trouble. Mercy tolerated the collar with the resignation of an animal too sick to mount serious resistance, but her eyes never left his face. There was intelligence there, Hank realized, the kind of awareness that suggested she understood more about her situation than a typical cow might. The afternoon brought visitors, though not the kind Hank had been hoping for. Jake Morrison pulled up in his newer pickup truck, followed by Tom Bradley and Mel Garrison. 3 ranchers who'd known the Rollins family for decades and felt entitled to offer opinions about Hank's recent decisions. Heard you bought yourself a buffalo yesterday, Jake said without preamble, leaning against the barn door with the casual authority of a man who'd never doubted his own judgment. $2, wasn't it? Word travels fast, Hank replied, continuing to measure out Mercy's afternoon medication. Fast enough to reach the bank, Tom Bradley added, his tone suggesting this was information Hank needed to hear. They're asking questions about your decision-making. Hank, wondering if maybe you're not thinking clearly these days. Hank straightened slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back that came with age and too many years of physical labor. And what do you think, Tom, about my decision-making? The three men exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that happened between people who'd known each other for decades. Mel stepped forward, his voice gentler than the others. "We think you're hurting, Hank. Think maybe you're trying to save something that can't be saved because you couldn't save Martha." The words hit harder than Hank had expected, mainly because there was truth in them. He had been trying to save Martha until the very end, researching experimental treatments, driving her to specialists in Denver and Salt Lake City, spending money they didn't have on hope they couldn't afford. "Could be you're right," Hank said finally. "Could be I'm a foolish old man who doesn't know when to quit. But this calf didn't ask to be born sick, and she didn't ask to be abandoned at that auction. All she's asking for now is a chance. And what happens when that chance costs you the ranch?" Jake pressed. "What happens when the bank decides you're not a safe investment anymore?" Hank looked through the stall door at Mercy, who had lifted her head to listen to the conversation. Even sick, even struggling for each breath, she was alert and engaged with the world around her. "Then I guess we'll deal with that when it happens." The men left without changing anything, but their visit accomplished something Hank hadn't expected. It clarified his thinking, helped him understand that saving Mercy wasn't just about the buffalo anymore. It was about proving to himself, to his doubters, maybe even to Martha's memory, that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were against you. That evening, as he settled into the barn with a thermos of coffee and an old army blanket, Hank began what would become a routine of round-the-clock vigilance. Every 4 hours, he checked Mercy's temperature, administered her medications, and made notes in a composition book that would serve as her medical record. By midnight, he was convinced they were going to lose her. By dawn, she was eating hay again. By the end of the week, he realized that saving Mercy might actually save him too. The empty antibiotic bottles began accumulating on the barn shelf like trophies in reverse, each one representing another $50 Hank couldn't afford, and another step deeper into a commitment that scared him more than he cared to admit. Penicillin, oxytetracycline, anti-inflammatory drugs with names he couldn't pronounce, but had learned to measure with the precision of a pharmacist. Dr. Chen had shown him how to calculate dosages based on Mercy's weight, how to draw medication into syringes without air bubbles, how to find the sweet spot in the neck muscle where injections caused the least stress. Within a week, Hank had developed the steady hands of a veteran nurse and the hollow-eyed look of a man who hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the whole thing started. The routine had become as fixed as sunrise, 6 a.m., temperature check and morning medications, followed by fresh hay and clean water. Noon brought another temperature reading and assessment of Mercy's general condition. Was she eating? Was the cough better or worse? Were her eyes bright or dull? 6 p.m. meant evening medications and the start of the night watch that had become Hank's new normal. He'd set up a cot in the barn office, a cramped space that had once served as Martha's record-keeping center when the ranch actually made money. Her ledger book still lined the shelves, documenting years of careful financial planning that seemed quaint now that he was spending grocery money on buffalo antibiotics. But the office had a clear view of Mercy's stall, and that's what mattered. "You're looking a little rough around the edges," Dr. Chen observed during her Friday morning visit, finding Hank hunched over a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. "When's the last time you got a full night's sleep?" Hank tried to remember and couldn't. "Sleep's overrated," he said, though his body disagreed with every joint and muscle. "How's she looking to you?" Sarah completed her examination with the same thoroughness she'd shown every day that week, listening to Mercy's chest, checking her temperature, evaluating her appetite and energy level. The buffalo had grown accustomed to these sessions, standing quietly while the veterinarian worked. "Better," Sarah said finally, and Hank felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched tight. Her breathing is less labored, and the congestion in her left lung has improved. She's gaining weight too, maybe 5 pounds since Monday. 5 pounds. It wasn't much, but it represented progress, proof that his round-the-clock vigilance was making a difference. Hank found himself smiling for the first time in days. "Don't get too excited yet," Sarah warned, reading his expression. "We're not out of the woods. Pneumonia can be tricky. Just when you think you're winning, it can flare up again. But this is definitely movement in the right direction." After she left, Hank sat with Mercy in comfortable silence, watching her work her way through a pile of alfalfa hay that would have cost him $8 at the feed store. Every bite represented money he didn't have, but also proof that she was fighting to live. He'd learned to measure progress in small victories. The first time she lifted her head when he entered the barn. The morning he found her standing instead of lying down. The afternoon she actually approached him instead of cowering in the corner. The similarities to Martha's illness were unavoidable, though Hank tried not to dwell on them. The same routine of medications and monitoring. The same careful attention to small changes in condition. The same exhausting blend of hope and fear that came with caring for a sick creature you couldn't bear to lose. But there were differences too. Martha had known what was happening to her, had been an active participant in her own care. She'd asked questions about treatments, researched her condition online, made decisions about what she was willing to endure and what she wasn't. Mercy simply endured whatever Hank thought was best, trusting him with a faith that felt heavier than any responsibility he'd ever carried. The phone calls with Dr. Chen had become daily check-ins, brief conversations where Hank reported symptoms and Sarah adjusted treatments accordingly. She'd started waiving her fees for these consultations, claiming they were follow-ups to the original visit, but Hank knew compassion when he saw it. "Temperature this morning?" she asked during Thursday's call. 101.6. "Down from yesterday. Appetite?" She finished all her hay and started working on the mineral block. First time she's shown interest in that? Good. Really good. "How about the cough?" Hank paused, listening to Mercy's breathing from across the barn. Still there, but not as harsh. More like clearing her throat than that awful rattling sound. "Keep doing what you're doing, Hank. I think we might actually pull this off." The financial strain was becoming impossible to ignore. The ranch account, already depleted by 3 years of medical bills and declining income, couldn't sustain many more veterinary expenses. Hank had started paying for medications with money borrowed against his truck, then against Martha's jewelry, then against tools he might need if he ever got the ranch running again. Jake Morrison stopped by on Saturday morning with an offer that sounded reasonable, until you thought about it too carefully. "Heard from Doc Chen that your buffalo's doing better," Jake said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into the kitchen chair that creaked under his weight. "That's good news, Hank. Real good news." "It is," Hank agreed, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Thing is, I've been thinking about your situation." "Financial situation, I mean." Jake studied the bottom of his coffee cup like he might find answers there. "What if I was to buy her from you? Pay what she's worth healthy, maybe even a little extra for your trouble." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a cigarette, tempting and toxic at the same time. Hank knew Jake well enough to recognize genuine concern mixed with practical opportunism. A recovered buffalo would be worth considerably more than $2, especially one with a story attached. "That's generous of you, Jake, but she's not for sale, not even if it means keeping the ranch." Hank looked through the kitchen window toward the barn, where Mercy was probably working her way through her afternoon hay. "Especially not if it means keeping the ranch." Jake left shaking his head, but without the buffalo. That evening, as Hank settled into his cot for another night of interrupted sleep, he realized he'd crossed some kind of line. Mercy wasn't just a sick animal he was trying to save anymore. She was family, the only family he had left. And family wasn't for sale at any price. The garden journal had been tucked away in Martha's dresser drawer for 3 years, beneath folded scarves and the lavender sachets she'd made to keep her clothes smelling like the herb garden that had been her sanctuary. Hank discovered it while looking for winter sweaters he could donate to the church clothing drive, trying to make room in a house that still felt too full of memories and too empty of life. Martha's handwriting filled every page in careful script, documenting planting schedules, weather patterns, and most interesting to Hank, detailed notes about medicinal herbs and their uses. echinacea for immune support, willow bark for inflammation, marshmallow root for respiratory problems. She'd been studying herbal remedies for years, apparently, making preparations that she'd shared with neighbors and friends without ever mentioning her expanding knowledge to her husband. Marshmallow root tea, 2 cups daily for chest congestion, he read aloud to Mercy, who was enjoying her first supervised venture outside the barn. Supports healthy lung function and soothes irritated airways. Martha had underlined this entry twice and added a note in the margin. Helped Mrs. Peterson's bronchitis when antibiotics weren't enough. Mercy seemed more interested in the grass beneath her feet than in herbal medicine discussions. But Hank continued reading anyway. After 2 weeks of barn confinement, she was moving carefully but deliberately, exploring the small paddock he'd enclosed next to the barn with portable fencing panels left over from better days. Her steps were still labored, and she tired quickly. But the fact that she was walking at all represented progress that filled Hank with something dangerously close to optimism. Dr. Chen had warned him against getting too hopeful too quickly, but watching Mercy discover the simple pleasure of sun on her back made it hard to maintain professional detachment. I think your wife was quite the herbalist, Dr. Chen had said when Hank called to ask about supplementing Mercy's conventional treatment with some of Martha's remedies. Marshmallow root is actually used in veterinary medicine, especially for respiratory conditions. As long as you don't stop the antibiotics, I don't see any harm in trying her tea recipe. The herbal supplements became part of the daily routine, administered in Mercy's water bucket twice daily. Whether they were actually helping or just making Hank feel more connected to Martha's memory, he couldn't say for certain. But Mercy seemed to enjoy the slightly sweet taste, and her cough continued to improve. It was during one of these outdoor sessions that Tommy Brennan first appeared, standing at the fence line with the intense focus that characterized everything he did. Hank had known the boy peripherally for years. He was 15 now, maybe 16, the son of Lisa Brennan, who worked at the post office and raised him alone after her divorce. Tommy had what the doctors called high-functioning autism, which meant he was brilliant in some ways and struggled in others. "That's a buffalo," Tommy said without preamble, his voice carrying the precise enunciation of someone who chose words carefully. "That's right," Hank agreed, walking over to where the boy stood. "Name's Mercy. She's been sick, but she's getting better." Tommy studied Mercy with the same intensity he brought to everything that caught his interest. Hank had heard from Lisa that her son could spend hours watching insects or memorizing the departure schedules for buses he never intended to ride. Most adults found Tommy's focused attention unsettling, but Hank had always appreciated people who saw the world differently. "She's breathing funny," Tommy observed. "Pneumonia," Hank explained. "Lung infection. But she's fighting it off. My mom had pneumonia when I was 12. She had to use an inhaler and drink special tea." Tommy paused, processing this information. "Does your buffalo have an inhaler?" The question was so practical and yet so innocent that Hank found himself smiling. "No inhaler, but she does get special tea. Made from herbs." This seemed to satisfy Tommy, who continued watching Mercy with unwavering attention. The buffalo, for her part, seemed equally fascinated by her young observer. She moved closer to the fence, close enough that Tommy could have touched her nose if he'd been inclined to reach through the rails. "She likes you," Hank said. "How can you tell?" "The way she's looking at you. And she came over here on her own. Usually she stays near the barn where she feels safe." Tommy considered this information seriously. "I like her too. She has kind eyes." When Lisa Brennan arrived 20 minutes later, clearly having tracked down her son with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to his wandering habits, she found Tommy still standing at the fence in quiet communion with Mercy. "I'm sorry," she said to Hank, slightly out of breath from walking. "He disappeared right after lunch, and Mrs. Patterson said she saw him heading this way." "Tommy, you know you're not supposed to leave the yard without telling me." "I wanted to see the buffalo," Tommy replied, as if this explained everything. Lisa looked at Mercy with the wariness of a mother who'd learned to anticipate danger in unexpected places. Is it safe, having him this close to a wild animal? Buffalo aren't exactly wild, Hank said gently. And Mercy's pretty calm. Been hand-raised mostly. But I understand your concern. What followed was the kind of careful negotiation that happened between adults trying to balance a child's interests with practical safety considerations. Lisa wanted to protect her son from potential harm. Tommy wanted to visit Mercy again. Hank found himself in the unexpected position of mediator, though he was clearly biased toward letting the boy return. He could come by after school, Hank suggested. When I'm here anyway, maybe help with some of the care routines. Might be good for both of them. Lisa studied her son, who was still watching Mercy, with the same focused attention he'd brought to their first meeting. You'd really want to help take care of her? Yes, Tommy said immediately. She needs friends. Being sick is lonely. The simple wisdom of this observation seemed to settle something for Lisa. All right, but only with Mr. Rollins present, and only if he's sure it's safe. That afternoon, after Lisa had extracted promises of caution from both Tommy and Hank, the boy helped mix Mercy's evening medications into her water bucket. His movements were careful and precise, and he asked thoughtful questions about dosages and timing that reminded Hank of Martha's approach to learning new things. "Why do you take care of her?" Tommy asked as they watched Mercy drink her medicated water. "She's not your buffalo, really. You just bought her at the auction." It was a question Hank had been asking himself for weeks, and he still didn't have a complete answer. "Sometimes you take care of something because it needs taking care of," he said finally. "And sometimes taking care of something ends up taking care of you too." Tommy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "My mom takes care of me, and I take care of my trains. They're not real trains, but they need someone to keep their tracks clean and make sure they run right." As the boy walked home that evening, chattering to his mother about buffalo care and herbal teas, Hank realized that Mercy's world was expanding beyond the barn, beyond the ranch, beyond his own lonely routine. For the first time since Martha's death, other people were becoming part of his story. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The walking stick began as something to do with his hands during the long hours of sitting with Mercy. But it evolved into something more meaningful as autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and rust. Hank had found the piece of oak in the barn's corner, part of a fence post that had been replaced years ago but never thrown away. Martha had always said he was too sentimental about keeping things that might be useful someday. Turned out she was right. Working the wood with his grandfather's carving knife gave structure to the quiet moments when Mercy dozed and Tommy wasn't there to fill the silence with his careful observations and endless questions. Hank carved slowly, methodically, letting the walking stick take shape the way his grandfather had taught him 50 years ago, not forcing the wood to become something it wasn't, but discovering what it wanted to be. By October, Mercy had gained 40 pounds and traded her labored breathing for the deep, steady rhythm of healthy lungs. Her coat had thickened for winter, transforming from the dull, patchy fur of a sick animal into the rich brown that would eventually darken to the near black of a mature buffalo. She moved with increasing confidence around the paddock, and her appetite had become a significant expense that Hank tried not to calculate too precisely. Tommy's visits had evolved from tentative afternoon check-ins to an established routine that both boy and buffalo seemed to depend upon. He arrived every day at 3:30, walking the mile from the school bus stop with a backpack full of homework he would complete while sitting cross-legged beside Mercy's paddock. The buffalo had learned to recognize the sound of his approach and would often be waiting at the fence when he rounded the corner of the barn. "She's gained 3 more pounds this week," Tommy announced on a Thursday afternoon, consulting the notebook where he'd been meticulously tracking Mercy's weight, temperature, and feed consumption. His attention to detail rivaled Dr. Chen's, and his observations had proven surprisingly useful in monitoring her progress. "You're getting pretty good at this veterinary assistant business," Hank said, adding another curved line to the walking stick's handle. The design was beginning to resemble something organic, maybe a vine, maybe a snake, maybe just the natural flow of wood grain guided by an old man's patient hands. Dr. Chen says I have good observational skills, Tommy replied with the matter-of-fact pride of someone stating a scientific conclusion. She says some veterinarians don't notice changes as quickly as I do. Dr. Chen had indeed become impressed with Tommy's careful attention to Mercy's condition. During her weekly visits, she'd started asking for the boy's input, treating his observations with the same seriousness she showed Hank's reports. It was Dr. Chen who first suggested that Tommy might have a future in animal care, if he was interested in pursuing that direction. The way he connects with Mercy is remarkable, she'd told Hank during a private conversation. Some people have a natural understanding of animal behavior, and Tommy definitely has that gift. Plus, his methodical approach to record-keeping is better than most veterinary students I've worked with. But it wasn't just Tommy and Dr. Chen who had begun to take notice of Mercy's remarkable recovery. Word had spread through the small ranching community with the efficiency of gossip and the weight of something approaching local legend. The sick buffalo that no one had wanted had become the buffalo that had beaten the odds. And Hank found himself fielding curious visitors with increasing frequency. Mrs. Patterson from the post office stopped by on her way home from town, bringing a jar of honey she claimed was good for respiratory health. Bill Torres, who ran the feed store, started asking about Mercy's condition whenever Hank picked up supplies, and had quietly begun giving him a 10% discount on hay and grain. Even Jake Morrison had softened his position, though he maintained that Hank's emotional attachment to the buffalo was financially irresponsible. "I still think you're crazy," he'd said during his most recent visit, "but I've got to admit she's turned into a fine-looking animal, worth considerably more than $2 now." The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered by a nervous young man from the bank who clearly hated his job. Hank read it twice, standing in his kitchen while coffee grew cold and Mercy waited for her morning hay. 90 days to bring the mortgage current or face loss of the property. The amount due was precise and devastating, $23,147.92, representing 18 months of missed or partial payments. Hank folded the notice carefully and placed it in the drawer with the ranch's other financial documents. Utility bills, veterinary expenses, and the accumulating evidence of a life being lived on borrowed time. Then he walked to the barn and began Mercy's morning routine as if nothing had changed. Tommy arrived that afternoon to find Hank working on the walking stick with unusual intensity, the carving knife moving in quick, sharp strokes that suggested agitation rather than his usual meditative patience. "Something's wrong," Tommy observed, settling into his usual spot with his homework spread around him. "You're carving angry today." Hank paused, surprised by the boy's perception. "How can you tell? The wood shavings are bigger, and you're breathing differently. Also, you haven't said anything to Mercy since I got here, and you always talk to her when I first arrive." It was true. Hank had developed the habit of providing a running commentary on the day's events for Mercy's benefit, a practice that Tommy had learned to interpret as a sign that all was well in their small world. "Bank wants to take the ranch," Hank said finally, returning to his carving with more controlled movements. "Got 90 days to find money I don't have." Tommy processed this information with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "What happens to Mercy if they take the ranch?" It was the question Hank had been avoiding since reading the foreclosure notice. "Don't know. Guess that depends on who buys the place and what they want to do with it." Tommy was quiet for several minutes, unusual for a boy who typically filled silences with observations about everything, from cloud formations to Mercy's eating habits. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination that Hank had never heard before. "We need to save the ranch," Tommy said, looking directly at Hank for the first time since the conversation began. "Mercy needs to stay here. This is her home now." The words, "we need to save the ranch," hung in the air between them, representing the first time Tommy had positioned himself as an active participant in solving a problem rather than simply observing and recording its details. It was a small breakthrough that suggested larger changes might be possible. For all of them, That evening, as Hank put the finishing touches on the walking stick's carved handle, he realized that what had started as busy work had become something more significant. The stick was sturdy enough to support weight, beautiful enough to be treasured, and useful enough to serve a purpose. Maybe that was all any of them could hope for, to become something sturdy, beautiful, and useful in the time they had left. The foreclosure notice lived in Hank's shirt pocket now, creased from folding and unfolding, worn soft from nervous handling during sleepless hours when the weight of impending loss pressed against his chest like a physical thing. He'd read it so many times he could recite the legal language from memory. But the cold facts remained unchanged. Pay $23,847.92 in 63 days, or lose everything. Lisa Brennan arrived on a Saturday morning with Tommy in tow and a manila envelope that she handled like it contained something fragile. She'd called ahead, which was unlike her. Their interactions had always been casual, built around Tommy's visits and brief conversations about buffalo care and weather. "We need to talk," she said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into the kitchen chair that had become the unofficial spot for serious conversations. Tommy had already headed to the barn, drawn by the magnetic pull that Mercy exerted on his daily routines. "If this is about Tommy spending too much time here," Hank began. "It's not." Lisa opened the envelope and withdrew a savings account statement, the kind of document that revealed private financial information people usually kept to themselves. "This is Tommy's college fund. His father started it before the divorce, and I've been adding to it when I can. It's not huge, but it's something." Hank looked at the balance, 11,438.67, and felt something twist in his stomach. "Lisa, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything," she interrupted, her voice carrying the firm tone of a woman who'd made up her mind. "Tommy came home yesterday and announced that he wants to use his college money to help save Mercy's home. We talked about it for 2 hours. He understands what college costs, understands what this money represents, and he still wants to help." Through the kitchen window, Hank could see Tommy in the paddock with Mercy, both of them moving with the easy comfort of old friends. The buffalo had grown sleek and strong over the past months, her coat thick and lustrous, her movements confident and purposeful. She looked nothing like the sick calf who'd wheezed through that auction 6 months ago. "He's found something here," Lisa continued, following Hank's gaze. "Purpose, I guess. Tommy's always been different, always struggled to connect with other kids his age. But with Mercy, with this place, he's become someone I barely recognize. More confident, more engaged with the world." The irony wasn't lost on Hank. Tommy was becoming more connected to the world, at the same time Hank was losing his place in it. "I appreciate what you're offering, Lisa, I really do. But even with Tommy's money, we're still 12,000 short. Then we find the rest," she said simply. "Tommy's not the only one who's noticed what you've done here. Mrs. Patterson's been talking about it at the post office. Bill Torres mentions it to every customer at the feed store. People are interested, Hank. They're invested." As if summoned by their conversation, a white SUV pulled into the driveway with the purposeful efficiency of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The woman who emerged was in her 30s, carrying a camera and a notebook with the unmistakable air of a journalist on assignment. "Mr. Rollins?" she called out as she approached the porch. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Casper Star-Tribune. I was hoping we could talk about your buffalo." Jennifer Walsh had driven 90 miles based on a tip from Dr. Chen, who'd mentioned Mercy's story during a conversation about large animal recovery cases. What started as professional curiosity had evolved into something more substantial when Jennifer learned about Tommy's involvement and the foreclosure threat hanging over the ranch. "This is exactly the kind of story our readers connect with," she explained, setting up her camera equipment while Mercy posed with the unconscious grace of an animal comfortable in her own skin. "Local man saves sick buffalo. Buffalo helps local boy with autism. Community rallies to save them both." It's got everything: compassion, determination, hope against long odds. Tommy proved to be a natural interview subject, answering Jennifer's questions with the same precise attention to detail he brought to everything else. He explained Mercy's medical history, demonstrated the record-keeping system he'd developed, and described their daily routines with the authority of someone who'd lived every moment of the recovery process. "She wasn't supposed to live," Tommy said, standing beside Mercy while Jennifer took photographs. "Everyone at the auction thought Mr. Rollins was wasting his money. But sometimes the thing that looks hopeless isn't hopeless at all. Sometimes it just needs someone to believe in it." Hank found himself simultaneously proud of Tommy's articulate responses and uncomfortable with the attention their story was generating. He'd always been a private man, more comfortable with the quiet satisfaction of work done well than with public recognition of his efforts. But as the afternoon progressed and Jennifer gathered more details about Mercy's transformation, Hank began to understand that the story was bigger than his personal discomfort. It was about second chances and the power of refusing to give up on something you believed in. It was about community and how small acts of kindness could ripple outward in unexpected ways. "When will the article run?" Lisa asked as Jennifer packed up her equipment. "Next Sunday's edition, front page of the lifestyle section. And I'm going to follow up with the paper's editorial board about doing a piece on small-scale agriculture and the challenges facing family ranchers." After Jennifer left, Hank found himself alone with the foreclosure notice and a growing sense that events were moving beyond his control. The article would bring more attention, possibly more visitors, maybe even potential donors. But it would also make his financial troubles public knowledge, transforming his private struggle into community business. That evening, as he and Tommy completed Mercy's routine care, Hank voiced the concern that had been gnawing at him all day. "What if the attention doesn't help?" he asked. "What if we raise some money but not enough? What if I end up losing the ranch anyway, and all these people feel like they wasted their time?" Tommy considered this question with his usual seriousness, stroking Mercy's neck while she dozed in the evening warmth. "My mom says worrying about things that might happen is like being afraid of rain when the sun is shining. You could miss a perfectly good day." The wisdom in this observation struck Hank with unexpected force. He'd spent so much time fearing loss that he'd nearly forgotten to appreciate what remained. Mercy was healthy and strong. Tommy had found purpose and confidence. The community was rallying around something worth saving. Maybe that was enough to build on. Maybe it was enough to hope on. Maybe, for the first time in 3 years, it was enough to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. The medal box had been buried beneath winter, and coats and Christmas decorations in Martha's bedroom closet for so long that Hank had almost forgotten its existence. Lisa discovered it by accident while helping him sort through Martha's belongings, items he'd been unable to face for 3 years, but finally felt ready to donate to families who could use them. "Hank," Lisa called from the bedroom, her voice carrying an odd note of surprise. "You need to see this." She was sitting on the floor beside Martha's cedar chest, holding a small wooden box that Hank recognized with a jolt of memory so sharp it made him catch his breath. The Army medal case was exactly as he'd left it in 1971, tucked away like a piece of evidence from someone else's life. "I was looking for winter coats for the church drive," Lisa explained, "and this fell out when I moved that old Army jacket. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry, but it opened when it hit the floor. The medals were arranged on faded blue velvet, exactly as the Army had presented them. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Medic Badge, and several service ribbons from his tour in Vietnam. Beside them lay the commendation letters that had accompanied the awards, praising Corporal Henry Rollins for exceptional courage under fire and devotion to duty that saved countless lives. Hank hadn't looked at these things in decades, hadn't thought about that version of himself, the young man who'd crawled through rice paddies under enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers, who'd performed battlefield surgery with hands steady enough to thread sutures while mortars exploded overhead. "You were a medic," Lisa said, her voice soft with understanding. "That's how you knew what to do for Mercy. That's how you knew about medications and treatments, and that was a long time ago," Hank interrupted, though even as he said it, he realized that some skills never left you. The steady hands that had once sutured shrapnel wounds had adapted easily to giving injections to a sick buffalo. The calm focus that had served him in combat triage had translated naturally to monitoring Mercy's vital signs through long nights of crisis. Tommy appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unusual tension in the adult voices. His eyes immediately fixed on the medals, studying them with the same intensity he brought to everything that captured his interest. "You were a hero," Tommy said matter-of-factly, as if stating an obvious scientific conclusion. "I was a kid doing my job," Hank corrected, though he knew the distinction would be lost on a boy who saw the world in simpler terms. Lisa carefully closed the medal case and handed it to Hank. "This explains so much. The way you approached Mercy's care, your confidence with the medical treatments. You've been a healer your whole life." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected visitor. This one driving a pickup truck that had seen better decades and bearing Wyoming plates from 3 counties over. The man who emerged was Hank's age, with the same weathered look of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors, but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career military man. "Well, I'll be damned," the visitor said, grinning broadly as he approached the porch. "Henry Rollins, still playing with sick animals." It took Hank a moment to place the face, but when recognition hit, it brought with it a flood of memories he'd thought were safely buried. "Sam Rodriguez, what the hell are you doing in Wyoming?" "Heard about your buffalo on the news last night," Sam replied, climbing the porch steps with the careful movements of a man whose joints remembered too many years of hard use. "Reporter mentioned you were a local rancher, showed your picture. Took me about 2 seconds to recognize the ugliest medic in Charlie Company." Sam Rodriguez had been Hank's tent mate, drinking buddy and closest friend during 13 months in Southeast Asia. They'd saved each other's lives multiple times, shared fears and hopes, and the dark humor that soldiers use to cope with unthinkable circumstances. After the war, they'd exchanged a few letters, but life had pulled them in different directions until contact finally faded altogether. "Last I heard, you were headed to Denver to work construction," Hank said, feeling the easy familiarity of old friendship despite 40 years of separation. "Did that for 20 years, then got into ranching myself. Small operation up in Montana, but it keeps me busy." Sam looked around the property with an appraising eye. "Heard you were having some financial trouble. Also heard you've got quite a story going with that buffalo." Lisa and Tommy had retreated to the kitchen to give the old soldiers privacy for their reunion, but Hank could see them through the window, clearly fascinated by this unexpected development in a story they thought they knew completely. Sam's arrival brought a perspective that Hank hadn't anticipated. Here was someone who remembered the young medic who'd crawled through minefields to reach wounded Marines, who'd worked 18-hour shifts in field hospitals, who'd earned his decorations by refusing to let people die when he had the skills to save them. "You know what I always admired about you?" Sam said as they walked toward the barn where Mercy was enjoying her afternoon hay. "You never gave up on anybody. Didn't matter how bad they were hurt, didn't matter what the odds were, if there was any chance at all. You'd fight for them." Mercy looked up as they approached, then returned her attention to the serious business of eating. She'd filled out magnificently over the past months, her coat glossy and thick, her movements confident and strong. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested she'd ever been the sick, abandoned calf from that auction. "She's a beauty," Sam observed. "Hard to believe she was dying 6 months ago." "Touch and go for weeks," Hank admitted. "There were nights I thought we'd lose her, but you didn't give up." "Same as always." Sam leaned against the fence, studying his old friend with eyes that had learned to read people during years when that skill meant survival. "Question is, what's the plan now? Can't fight a foreclosure with good intentions." It was exactly the kind of direct question that Sam had always asked, cutting through emotion and circumstance to focus on practical solutions. Hank found himself explaining the financial situation, the community support that was beginning to build, the newspaper article that might generate more help. "Sounds like you need to make this bigger," Sam said when Hank finished. One newspaper article is good, but you need to reach more people. Tell the story to folks who might actually have money to help. I'm not comfortable asking for charity, Hank said, the words coming automatically from a lifetime of pride and self-reliance. This isn't charity, Sam corrected. This is people investing in something they believe in. You've created something here that matters, not just to you, not just to that boy, but to everyone who's heard the story. Sometimes accepting help isn't about swallowing your pride. It's about recognizing that what you've built is bigger than just you. That evening, after Sam had driven back to Montana with promises to spread word about Mercy's story through his network of veteran friends, Hank sat on his porch with the medal case in his lap. The young soldier who'd earned these decorations had believed in fighting for things that mattered, even when the odds were against him. Maybe it was time for that soldier to make one more stand, not in a rice paddy or field hospital, but in a barn in Wyoming, where a buffalo named Mercy had taught an old man that healing others was the best way to heal yourself. Tommy's words from earlier echoed in his mind. You were a hero. Perhaps the boy was right in his simple way. Perhaps being a hero wasn't about medals or recognition, but about refusing to let something die when you had the power to save it. The foreclosure notice was still in his pocket, still represented an impossible amount of money. But for the first time since receiving it, Hank began to believe that impossible might not mean hopeless. Sometimes, as he'd learned in war and relearned with Mercy, miracles happened when ordinary people decided to do extraordinary things. The fundraising thermometer appeared overnight on a piece of plywood beside Murphy's diner, painted in bright red with black numbers marking increments up to $25,000. Lisa had organized its creation with the efficiency of a military campaign, recruiting high school art students to design it and Tommy to calculate the precise measurements needed to track their progress towards saving the ranch. $3,247 already, Tommy announced during his Tuesday afternoon visit, consulting the notebook where he'd been tracking donations with the same meticulous attention he gave to Mercy's care records. Mrs. Patterson says people have been stopping by the post office all day to contribute. The speed at which the community had mobilized surprised everyone, including Hank, within days of Jennifer Walsh's article appearing in the Casper Star-Tribune. Donations had begun arriving from sources as varied as the local 4-H clubs, bake sale proceeds, and a check for $500 from a retired teacher in Cheyenne who'd been moved by Mercy's story. Dr. Chen had contributed both money and professional credibility, writing a letter to the Regional Veterinary Association, describing Mercy's recovery as a testament to dedicated care and the healing power of the human-animal bond. The letter had been forwarded to colleagues across the state, generating additional donations and inquiries about visiting what some were beginning to call Mercy's Miracle Ranch. But the local support was just the beginning. On Wednesday morning, Hank's phone rang with a call that changed everything. Mr. Rollins, this is Maria Santos from Good Morning America. We saw the story about you and Mercy in the Tribune, and we'd like to send a crew to Wyoming to film a segment for our show. The conversation that followed left Hank feeling like he'd been caught in a whirlwind. National television, millions of viewers, the kind of attention that could transform a local story into something much larger and more complicated. Maria explained that they were particularly interested in Tommy's involvement and the therapeutic aspects of his relationship with Mercy. Human interest stories about animal therapy are very popular with our audience, she said. And the fact that this started with a $2 act of compassion, our viewers will love that. After hanging up, Hank sat in his kitchen staring at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. National television meant exposure beyond anything he'd imagined, but it also meant scrutiny, questions, and a level of public attention that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Tommy, on the other hand, was thrilled when Hank explained about the television crew that would arrive Friday morning. We need to make sure Mercy looks her best, Tommy said seriously. And we should prepare talking points about her medical history and recovery timeline. Television people like facts and specific details. It was Lisa who first suggested that the attention might serve a purpose beyond simply raising money to save the ranch. She'd been researching animal therapy programs online, learning about established facilities that used horses, dogs, and other animals to help children and adults with various challenges. What if this becomes something permanent? She asked during a planning meeting in Hank's kitchen. What if instead of just saving the ranch, we create something that could help other kids like Tommy? The idea had been percolating in various forms since Dr. Chen first mentioned Tommy's natural affinity for animal care. But Lisa's suggestion gave it shape and urgency, the possibility that Mercy's story could become the foundation for something larger and more meaningful than anyone had originally imagined. Animal Therapy Sanctuary, Tommy said, testing the words. Mercy's Place Animal Therapy Sanctuary. That sounds official. Dr. Chen, who had become an unofficial advisor to their growing operation, was enthusiastic about the therapeutic potential. Tommy's progress since he started working with Mercy has been remarkable, she told the group. Increased verbal communication, improved social interaction, better emotional regulation. If we could replicate that experience for other children. The conversation was interrupted by another unexpected visitor. This one driving a black luxury SUV with Colorado plates and wearing the kind of expensive suit that looked out of place in rural Wyoming. Marcus Webb represented a Denver development company that had been quietly acquiring ranch land throughout the region for a luxury resort project. Mr. Rollins, he said, presenting a business card and a practiced smile. I understand you're facing some financial difficulties. My company would like to make you an offer that could solve all your problems. The offer was substantial, $400,000 for the 800-acre ranch, enough to pay off the mortgage, cover Hank's debts, and leave him with a comfortable sum for retirement. In exchange, he would need to vacate the property within 60 days, taking Mercy with him. It's a very generous offer, Webb continued when Hank didn't respond immediately. Considerably above market value for agricultural land in this area. And frankly, it may be the only realistic solution to your current situation. Hank studied the contract Webb had placed on his kitchen table, noting the company letterhead and the legal language that would transfer ownership of everything his family had built over 3 generations. It was a clean solution, a practical resolution that would eliminate all his problems at once. I'll need to think about it, Hank said finally. Of course. But I should mention that this offer has an expiration date. We need an answer by Friday afternoon, regardless of any media attention your situation might be generating. After Webb left, Hank found himself alone with a decision that felt impossibly complex. The developer's offer would solve his immediate financial crisis, but it would also end everything. The ranch, Mercy's home, Tommy's sanctuary, the community project that had brought so many people together around something worth saving. The Good Morning America crew arrived Friday morning as promised. A team of 3 people with enough equipment to outfit a small television station. Maria Santos turned out to be younger than she'd sounded on the phone, with the kind of polished professionalism that made Hank feel like he was wearing his best clothes to a casual barbecue. But Tommy was a natural in front of the cameras, explaining Mercy's care routine with the confidence of someone who'd found his calling. He demonstrated the record-keeping system, showed how he prepared Mercy's medications, and described their daily interactions with the precise vocabulary of a young scientist. She understands that I'm here to help, Tommy told Maria, while Mercy posed patiently for the cameras. Animals can sense when people care about them. Mercy knows I care about her, and I know she cares about me. That's how therapy works. It's about caring. The interview with Hank was more challenging. Maria asked thoughtful questions about his motivation for buying Mercy, his background as a combat medic, and his feelings about the community support that had developed around their story. But she also asked about the foreclosure, the financial pressure, And what would happen if they couldn't raise enough money? Sometimes you fight for something because it's worth fighting for, Hank said when Maria asked why he hadn't simply sold Mercy to pay his debts. This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations. Mercy has become part of that family. Some things aren't for sale at any price. As the television crew packed up their equipment, Hank realized that he'd made his decision without consciously thinking about it. Marcus Webb's offer might solve his financial problems, but it would betray everything that Mercy's recovery had come to represent. The power of refusing to give up, the value of community support, the possibility that broken things could be healed with patience and care. The fundraising thermometer showed $392 by Friday evening, still far short of what they needed, but growing steadily as word spread through networks of friends, family and strangers who'd been touched by the story. Tommy had calculated that they needed to raise an average of $347 per day to reach their goal before the bank's deadline. It's mathematically challenging, but not impossible, he announced after updating his spreadsheet, especially if the television show generates significant additional donations. That night, as Hank completed Mercy's evening routine, he found himself thinking about the young medic who'd earned those medals 40 years ago. That soldier had believed in fighting for lost causes, in refusing to let people die when there was any chance of saving them. Maybe saving a ranch and a buffalo and a boy's sense of purpose wasn't so different from saving wounded soldiers in a rice paddy. Maybe the principles were the same: courage, determination, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat when something important was at stake. The bank's deadline was still 23 days away. The fundraising thermometer still showed a daunting gap between reality and hope. But as Mercy settled into her evening hay with the contentment of an animal who knew she was loved and safe, Hank began to believe that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. After all, he'd won impossible victories before. The sanctuary charter arrived by overnight courier on the morning of the fundraiser, its official legal language transforming what had begun as one man's desperate attempt to save a sick buffalo into something with permanence and legitimacy. Lisa had worked with a lawyer in Casper to draft the documents establishing Mercy's Place Animal Therapy Sanctuary, complete with non-profit status and a mission statement that Tommy had helped write, to provide healing and hope through the human-animal bond, Hank read aloud, standing in his kitchen while volunteers outside arranged tables and strung lights for the evening's event. To offer sanctuary for animals in need and therapy for people seeking connection and purpose. The words looked strange in legal typography, but they captured something essential about what had evolved on the ranch over the past 8 months. What had started as an impulse purchase at a livestock auction had become a symbol of possibility for everyone who'd been touched by Mercy's story. By 4 o'clock, the crowd exceeded everyone's expectations. Cars and pickup trucks lined the ranch road for half a mile in both directions, their occupants walking toward the barn with the purposeful stride of people on a mission. Local families mixed with visitors who'd driven from neighboring states, some carrying signs that read "Save Mercy's Ranch" and "Heroes come in all sizes." Mercy handled the attention with the calm dignity of an animal who'd grown accustomed to being the center of positive human attention. She stood in her paddock, accepting gentle touches and posed patiently for photographs, her natural composure suggesting she understood the importance of the day. Tommy moved through the crowd with newfound confidence, explaining Mercy's care routine to anyone who asked, and demonstrating the record-keeping system that had impressed Dr. Chen and the television crew. His mother watched from a distance with the proud expression of someone seeing her child discover his own capabilities. The formal program began at sunset, with Hank standing on a makeshift platform that Jake Morrison had constructed from hay bales and plywood. The crowd quieted as he looked out over faces both familiar and strange, all united by their belief in something worth saving. 6 months ago, I bid $2 on a sick buffalo because it seemed like the right thing to do, Hank began, his voice carrying clearly across the evening air. I never imagined that small act would lead to this. To all of you. To this community coming together around something that matters." He paused, looking toward Mercy's paddock, where she stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. "But that's what Mercy taught me, that healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when people care enough to get involved, when they refuse to let something valuable be lost." The financial update brought cheers and applause. The combination of the fundraiser, online donations generated by the television appearance, and contributions from veterinary associations across the region had raised $31,247, enough to satisfy the bank and establish an operating fund for the sanctuary. But the evening's most powerful moment came when Tommy stepped onto the platform to address the crowd. Public speaking had always been a challenge for him, but standing beside Mercy's paddock with the support of everyone who'd believed in their story, he found his voice. "My name is Tommy Brennan, and Mercy saved my life," he began, his words carrying across the silent crowd with remarkable clarity. "Not the way Mr. Rollins saved hers. I wasn't sick or dying, but I was lonely and scared and didn't know how to connect with people." He described the first day he'd seen Mercy, how her illness had made him feel useful and needed in ways he'd never experienced. He talked about learning to read animal behavior, about the confidence that came from being trusted with important responsibilities, about discovering that being different wasn't the same as being less than. "Mercy taught me that healing is something you do together," Tommy concluded. "She needed Mr. Rollins to take care of her body, and she needed me to be her friend. I needed both of them to learn who I could become." The sanctuary charter was signed in front of the crowd, with Hank's signature making official what had been growing organically for months. Dr. Chen signed as the veterinary advisor, Lisa as the education coordinator, and Tommy as the first official youth volunteer. As the evening wound down and visitors began the journey home, Hank found himself standing beside Mercy's paddock with a sense of completion that had been missing from his life since Martha's death. The ranch was saved, the sanctuary was established, and the community had proved that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together towards something meaningful. "We did it," Tommy said, appearing beside him with the satisfied expression of someone who'd helped solve an important problem. "We saved Mercy's home." "We did," Hank agreed, though he understood now that they'd saved much more than a piece of land. They'd saved hope itself, proving that love and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The new sign arrived 3 weeks after the fundraiser. Its professionally carved letters spelling out Mercy's Place Animal Therapy Sanctuary, founded by Hank Rollins, in elegant script across weathered pine boards. Tommy had chosen the font from a catalogue, insisting that it needed to look both official and welcoming. The installation crew positioned it at the ranch entrance, where everyone entering the property would understand immediately that something special happened here. The official opening ceremony drew families from across Wyoming and neighboring states, many traveling hundreds of miles with children who struggled with challenges similar to Tommy's. Word had spread through networks of special education teachers, therapists, and support groups for families dealing with autism, anxiety, and other conditions that might benefit from animal interaction. Sarah Martinez had driven from Denver with her 8-year-old son, Alex, who hadn't spoken since a car accident that claimed his father 6 months earlier. Dr. Kim Lawson brought her daughter Emma, whose severe anxiety had made traditional therapy ineffective. The Hendersons traveled from Montana with twin boys whose autism spectrum diagnoses had left them feeling isolated from their rural community. Mercy seemed to understand the significance of the day, moving through the gathering with the calm presence of a natural therapist. She allowed children to touch her gently, stood patiently while nervous parents took photographs, and displayed the kind of intuitive sensitivity that Dr. Chen had begun documenting for a research paper about animal-assisted therapy. "She knows," Tommy observed, watching Mercy interact with Alex Martinez, who had been silent since arriving, but was now humming softly while stroking her neck. She can tell which kids need quiet and which ones need encouragement. It was true. Mercy's responses seemed calibrated to each child's individual needs, calm and still for the anxious ones, gently playful with those who needed engagement, patient and steady for children who required time to build trust. Her natural ability to adapt her behavior suggested that some animals possessed therapeutic instincts that couldn't be taught or trained. Dr. Chen moved through the gathering, documenting interactions, taking notes that would support her growing belief that Mercy represented something unique in the field of animal therapy. Traditional programs typically used horses or dogs specifically trained for therapeutic work. But Mercy's effectiveness seemed to stem from her own personality and experience rather than formal preparation. "She's been a patient herself," Dr. Chen explained to a visiting journalist. "She understands what it's like to be vulnerable and dependent on others for care. That experience has made her remarkably sensitive to others who are struggling." The ceremony's emotional centerpiece came when Hank stood to address the gathering, speaking from the same platform where Tommy had given his breakthrough speech 3 weeks earlier. But this time, his words carried the weight of someone who'd discovered his true purpose later in life than expected. 8 months ago, "I thought my useful years were behind me," he began, looking out over families who'd traveled great distances to be part of something they'd only heard about, but believed in. "I was a widower on a failing ranch, counting down days until the bank took everything I'd worked for." He paused, his eyes finding Martha's garden, now restored and maintained by volunteers who understood its significance to the sanctuary's history. "My wife Martha always said that every ending was also a beginning, but I couldn't see that truth until Mercy came into my life. Or maybe until I came into hers." The speech continued with Hank describing the lessons he'd learned about healing, about community, about the power of refusing to give up on something worth saving. He talked about Tommy's transformation, about Dr. Chen's research, about the families who were discovering that their children could connect with animals in ways that traditional therapy hadn't achieved. "Mercy saved my life by giving me a purpose," he concluded. "Now I hope she can help save others by giving them the same gift, the knowledge that they matter, that they're not alone, that healing is possible when people care enough to make it happen." The memorial garden dedication that followed honored Martha's memory with a bronze plaque reading, "In loving memory of Martha Rollins, whose healing wisdom lives on in this place." Lisa had organized its creation with input from Hank and Tommy, ensuring that Martha's contribution to the sanctuary's foundation would be permanently acknowledged. As afternoon turned to evening and families began preparing for their journeys home, several made commitments to return for extended stays. The Hendersons scheduled a week-long visit for the following month. Sarah Martinez enrolled Alex in a summer program that Dr. Chen was developing. Emma Lawson's parents requested information about relocating to Wyoming so their daughter could have regular access to Mercy's calming influence. Tommy moved through the departing crowds with the confidence of someone who'd found his calling, exchanging contact information with other young people and promising to maintain correspondence about Mercy's progress. His transformation from an isolated boy to a confident young advocate for animal therapy represented the sanctuary's mission in its purest form. The new sign glowed in the sunset light as the last visitors departed, its message clear to anyone who might drive past. Something extraordinary had been built here, something worth the journey to experience. What had started as an act of compassion had become a beacon of hope for families seeking connection and healing in an often disconnected world. The photo album lived on the kitchen table now, its pages filled with pictures that told the story of transformation in faces both human and animal. 6 months after the sanctuary's official opening, Hank found himself turning through these photographs most mornings with his coffee, studying the evidence of what had grown from a $2 act of compassion. Alex Martinez smiled in 17 different photos, his progression from silent grief to animated joy, documented week by week during his summer stays at the ranch. Emma Lawson appeared calmer in each successive picture, her anxiety visibly diminishing as her confidence with Mercy grew. The Henderson twins had learned to work together, caring for the sanctuary's newest residents, a rescue horse named Hope and two abandoned goats that Tommy had named Faith and Charity. We've helped 43 families so far, Tommy announced during his daily after-school report, consulting the detailed records he'd maintained since becoming the sanctuary's official youth coordinator. And we have 17 more scheduled to visit before Christmas. The Tide Sanctuary had evolved far beyond anything Hank had imagined when he'd first brought home a sick buffalo calf. Dr. Chen's research had attracted attention from universities studying animal-assisted therapy, leading to partnerships that provided both funding and credibility. The State Tourism Board had designated Mercy's Place as an official attraction, bringing visitors who contributed to the local economy while spreading word about the sanctuary's mission. But the real measure of success lived in the letters that arrived weekly from families whose lives had been touched by their time at the ranch. Parents wrote about children who'd spoken their first words while sitting with Mercy, teenagers who'd found purpose in caring for rescue animals, adults who'd discovered that healing could happen at any age when the right connections were made. "Dear Mr. Rollins," read the morning's delivery, a handwritten note from Sarah Martinez in Denver. "Alex started talking again last week, 3 words at first, then sentences. Then he couldn't stop telling me about Mercy and the sanctuary and when we can visit again. His therapist says the breakthrough came from feeling needed and useful, from having something he cared about enough to communicate about. Thank you for giving my son his voice back." Similar testimonials filled a filing cabinet that had once held ranch business records, but now documented a different kind of productivity. Dr. Chen estimated that the sanctuary's success rate with therapeutic breakthroughs exceeded 90%, a figure that had attracted attention from medical schools and therapy programs across the country. Mercy herself had settled into the role of lead therapist with the same natural grace she'd brought to her recovery. Now fully mature at 800 pounds of muscle and calm intelligence, she seemed to understand intuitively which children needed gentle encouragement and which required patient stillness. Her ability to adapt her behavior to individual needs had become the subject of Dr. Chen's doctoral dissertation and multiple research papers. "She's teaching us as much as we're teaching the children," Dr. Chen observed during her weekly visit, watching Mercy work with a shy 7-year-old from Colorado whose parents had driven 6 hours for this first session. "Her therapeutic instincts are remarkable, almost like she remembers being vulnerable and wants to help others who feel the same way." Tommy had grown into his role as junior coordinator, with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd brought to monitoring Mercy's recovery. Now 17 and preparing for college applications, he decided to study veterinary medicine with a focus on animal therapy. Several universities had already expressed interest in his experience and his detailed documentation of the sanctuary's therapeutic outcomes. "I want to open 5 more sanctuaries," Tommy explained during a planning meeting with Hank and Lisa, "one in each state surrounding Wyoming, so more families can have access to this kind of help. We could train other people to do what we've learned to do here." The expansion vision represented everything the sanctuary had become. Not just a place where one buffalo had found healing, but a model that could be replicated wherever there were animals needing rescue and people needing connection. Several veterinary students had already completed internships at Mercy's Place, learning techniques they could take to other communities and other programs. On a crisp October morning that reminded Hank of the day he'd first seen Mercy at the auction, he found himself driving the familiar route to the livestock sale barn, not to buy anything this time, but to speak to a gathering of ranchers about the economic benefits of agritourism and therapeutic agriculture. The irony wasn't lost on him that the place where he'd made the most impulsive decision of his life had become a venue for sharing the wisdom that decision had taught him. The auction barn looked exactly the same, dusty, utilitarian, filled with the sounds and smells of rural commerce. But Hank's perspective had changed completely. Where he'd once seen only the end of his ranching career, he now understood that he'd been witnessing the beginning of something entirely different and infinitely more meaningful. Sometimes the things that look like endings are actually beginnings in disguise, he told the assembled ranchers, echoing Martha's wisdom about life's transitions. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything, not just for the recipient, but for everyone who gets caught up in the ripple effects. The drive home took him past the sign that still filled him with quiet pride. Mercy's Place Animal Therapy Sanctuary, founded by Hank Rollins. But he knew the truth was more complex and beautiful than any sign could convey. The sanctuary hadn't been founded by him alone, but by everyone who'd believed in the possibility of healing, everyone who'd contributed time or money or hope to keeping the dream alive. That evening, as he completed the rounds that had become routine over 18 months of sanctuary operation, Hank paused beside Mercy's paddock to watch her settle into her evening hay. She was no longer the sick, abandoned calf he'd rescued on impulse, but a magnificent animal whose presence had created connections and healing for dozens of families. The photo album would gain new pictures tomorrow, when another family arrived seeking help for their daughter. Next week, a documentary crew would visit to film a segment about innovative approaches to therapy. Next month, construction would begin on a new cabin for families making extended stays. But tonight, it was enough to stand in the Wyoming darkness with a buffalo named Mercy and know that sometimes $2 and a willing heart could change the world, one healing at a time.